This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. According to a recent poll, an astounding 53% of people under 30 years old viewed socialism favorably. Given the disastrous track record of socialist countries, I'm guessing 52% of the people polled didn't know what real socialism is. On today's show, we're going to begin by discussing Venezuela's economy. Not too long ago, Venezuela was the darling of Bernie Sanders, Michael Moore, Oliver Stone, and other socialists. Today, it's a starving basket case. Then, on the second half of the show, we'll discuss India's economic performance after independence. India did not embrace full-fledged socialism, but its government did engage in a similar sort of comprehensive planning of the economy. My first guest is Dr. Kevin Grier. Dr. Grier is the Gordon Tullock Professor of Political Economy here at Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and a professor in the Political Science Department. He's written scores of research studies, including a recent one on the impact of Hugo Chávez's policies on the Venezuelan economy. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's start off with kind of where this started, almost 20 years ago, 1998, when Chávez comes to power. And he says, we're going to implement Bolivarian socialism. What is that? What are the policies? What was he doing there?
Okay. So there's two quick answers to this. One is what he said it was, and one is what actually happened.
Fair enough. So that's probably true of politicians everywhere.
Right. So the claim of Bolivarian socialism was to be anti-imperialist, above all, anti the United States, more self-sufficient, more solidarity with other Latin American countries, to address inequality, to address poverty, and indigenous rights. Mm-hmm. So it was very much a reaction to sort of the elite-run democracy of Venezuela in the past, and it was meant to be sort of pan-South American. What it actually was a big change in the political institutions of the country that made power be very concentrated in the executive branch, in Chávez.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of economic policy then, what did that translate to after he concentrated his power? How did he change what the rules of the game were?
So after the concentration of power, when the new legislature was put in, one of the first things they did was give him ability to sort of rule by decree. And so he was essentially making laws, and it wouldn't have mattered too much because he had a huge majority in the one chamber that he controlled. The rules were that there were no rules, kind of. The rules were whatever Chávez decided to do goes. There's a story that he held an international conference on an island like the hotel, told one of his guys, hey, we're going to nationalize this hotel and use it for a government meeting center from now on. So the rules were anything could happen.
Property rights were insecure.
Property rights were very much less secure, and policy course was very erratic. Inflation was interesting. The rules for exchange rates kept changing. Who could redeem currencies, at what parity, for what purposes. So the access to foreign currency was very politicized and things like that.
And if we go back, not even 10 years now, he died in 2013, I think.
12 or 13, yeah.
The reaction of people in the United States who have sympathies for socialism, the Bernie Sanders of the world. I mean, Oliver Stone even did a documentary called Mi Amigo, Hugo Chávez.
Right.
But it's not just idiots in Hollywood or politicians. I mean, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, as late as 2007 was complimenting the high growth in Venezuela. Right. What was it about the success of Chávez that people were, or what was the success that people thought they saw in this unique brand of so-called socialism?
So I can speak to this directly because we studied this in the paper that you mentioned in your introduction. There were improvements in infant mortality. Infant mortality fell very steadily through the Chávez regime. There were some improvements in poverty rates. Inequality fell, and there was some economic growth. So those are all things that people like, especially people on the left really like, oh, there's less inequality and so on. And and everybody's in favor of lower infant mortality rates and improved maternal health and things like that. So those things happened.
Mm-hmm. And this was, contrasted with the failure. There's not that many real socialist countries left. No one holds up Cuba as the economic dynamo or North Korea. Right. This was the one success that they looked to. But in your paper, you said, so those things are real, that there were improvements, but this wasn't Hugo Chávez and socialism.
Right. So at the risk of being overly technical, we use a procedure called synthetic control, where we statistically create an artificial Venezuela that's a weighted average of similar countries. We do that from 1970 to 1998, before Chávez. So that, if we forecast those countries' average weights into the future, That would give us a counterfactual, what would have happened in Venezuela if Chavez hadn't been elected and enacted his policies.
So basically what you're doing is taking a bundle of other countries and looking at, as we piece parts of all of them together, what looks the most like Venezuela for 30 years, almost 30 years prior to him coming to power.
And it was a combination of Iran, which was an oil country like Venezuela, Mexico, which is both Latin American and oil, Peru, which is Latin American. So these countries make sense with the weights of them.
And then, so they track it really well up until Chavez comes to power.
Right.
What happens after that?
Well, case by case. In the case, the worst case for Venezuela and for Chavez is per capita incomes. Per capita incomes are relatively flat, and then they start to rise. But in the counterfactual countries, in the controls, income rises really rapidly. And that's because oil prices took off, and these are oil countries. So oil prices took off. The counterfactual takes off with the oil prices. Chavez's economy in Venezuela lags for 4.5 years before it finally starts to take off.
And still stays behind it.
Still stays behind. We, at the end of our study in 2010, Venezuela, real per capita income in Venezuela was 25% less than it should have been according to the counterfactual.
Yeah, so what people were looking at and saying is a success here of economic growth is just oil masking stuff that's actually gone awry.
Yes, and we can see that now, especially because oil prices have fallen, and no one is saying Venezuela is a success now. Right? They're actually saying Venezuela is 30% poorer now than it was when Chavez died, and they were 25% poorer than they should have been at the end of the Chavez regime. So things in Venezuela are way, way worse than just simply saying incomes have fallen.
Yeah, in fact,
because they've fallen from a base that's lower, way lower than it should have been.
I'm not positive, but off the top of my head, as I recall seeing statistics, actually, like relative to 1970, incomes now are back to about what they were 40 years and more than 40 years.
I haven't studied that exact comparison either, but they are quite a bit lower than they were in 2012. Say.
And these other things that you find, child mortality, inequality, stuff like that, did they make successes there?
So if you especially look at like infant mortality and maternal health, there's just a straight decline. But if you plot, you don't even need a synthetic control. If you just plot Venezuela before Chavez, steady decline. Mm-hmm. So just the pre-Chavez trend is matched by Chavez's performance, or the synthetic is matched by Chavez's performance. So in health outcomes, we find no impact. In poverty outcomes, we find no impact. We do see a tiny bit of an impact in inequality. Mm-hmm. That inequality gets a little bit better under Chavez than it would have from the controls, but it's a weird kind of reduction in inequality. Because if poverty doesn't fall, but inequality falls, that just means you're hammering the rich people and not really gaining anything for the poor people. So it's inequality by chopping the top rather than lifting up the bottom.
So the punchline is basically that oil prices made it look like there was economic growth and made other things improve no better than what they should have anyway. And again, masking what would have otherwise been a decline. So today, people, socialist advocates now see Venezuela and they say, well, it's not the fault of socialism, it's just the decline in oil prices has hammered them. Well, what do you say to that? I mean, there's some truth to that.
Well, it's certainly true. The decline of oil prices has hammered them. I used to live in Oklahoma, which is far from socialist, and the decline in oil prices has hammered Oklahoma as well. But, I mean, the rise in oil prices was a tremendous opportunity for Venezuela to make real progress, and it was squandered through uncertainty, politicization of almost every decision, and just poor economic management.
And what do we see going on there today? I think actually what's happening in Venezuela seems underreported in TV news in the United States, given the really tragedy that's happening there right now.
International companies won't do business there anymore. International airlines won't fly there anymore. People can't get hard currency. There's, toilet paper is more valuable than the money. Like literally, a square of toilet paper or a 20 Bolivar note, take the toilet paper every time, because there's just no value in the currency and basic commodities are scarce. And it's a really, really grim situation there that I don't see a quick, happy solution to.
So get into what's the policy on the ground there that's making it so grim today?
It's just a continuation. I mean, Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, just followed the Chavez line. If a company isn't doing what you want, try to nationalize it or call it an economic criminal raid the stores, sell it in the local stores. It's runaway inflation, political access to hard currency, to the exchange, ruining the banking sector, and just there aren't, people can't make money importing goods. You either can't get the hard currency, or price controls make it unable for you to sell it at a reasonable price. So people are black marketing, people are going over the border to Colombia, making long trips over the border to Colombia to buy basic goods and things like that.
Yeah, I was on the Colombian-Venezuelan border recently and met families who had traveled 3.5 days to go buy groceries because they were simply, and those are upper middle class Venezuelans because they can actually afford to make the trip that far and have some currency to trade.
Now there still is stuff in the government stores. If you wait in line long enough and get there early enough to get there while it's still there, they are providing that. And the poor, that's really their main base that they're trying to still support. So that is happening. People who can get stuff at these low prices are doing okay if you don't mind waiting around forever to get it.
But I think it's even worse than that. As they wait around, I read something, and it was in metrics, so I'll get the math wrong, but it was something like the average Venezuelan lost 5 kilograms in the last year, something about that.
People are getting skinnier, people's health. It's a really dire situation. A really dire situation for sure.
So in just like the last minute that we have then, are there any prospects for a turnaround, or what would it take for them to get back on a path that, because Venezuela used to be one of the relatively wealthy countries in Latin America when we go back 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Go back further and it was richer than the United States in say like the late 1800s. So yeah, I don't see any way for Venezuela to even be moderately okay with the same set of policies being pursued. Inflation is astronomical. Price controls mean that no private sector wants to get in there, and they can't. Price controls plus high inflation, it's just there's no way for the economy to work, for prices to have any value, to be any signals to draw resources to the area. So absent some change that lets prices do what they're going to do, or just a massive relief effort, I guess, but that would just be temporary. I don't, beside regime change in time, I don't see much positive to think about there.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation, but thank you for joining us to talk about it.
Well, thank you.
Up next, ever heard of the abysmal Hindu rate of economic growth? Our next guest will describe how the Indian government's economic planning led to it.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. G.P. Manish. Dr. Manish is an associate professor of economics and a member of the Manuel H. Johnson Center of Political Economy at Troy University. He's also a native of India who's written extensively on India's economic performance. GP, welcome to Texas Tech and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for having me.
So, the theme of this show is kind of socialism and central planning of the economy.
Right.
The Indian government never embraced full-on socialism, did it?
No, not the way, for example, in the Soviet Union, but it did plan. It did have a 5-year plan, so there was a big public sector that grew up, and it also really regulated the private sector, with the result that effectively the private sector was doing what the government wanted it to do.
So in 1947, get independence, and this is kind of the height of the ideology of both, of really centrally planning, at least the commanding heights of the economy, both in socialist countries and in
developing countries in general. So that was one important factor, because that was what all the experts were saying. If you want to have rapid industrial growth, become like the West, do this, right? Socialize, have a big public sector, stuff like that. The other factor was the fact that the Soviet Union figures coming out of the Great Depression era were so good. So lots of, the leaders, intellectual and political leaders in India and other developing countries were saying, all right, look at that. They bucked the whole, failed era of the 1930s. So this is the way to go.
So in India's case, then they maintained private ownership, but lost private control and replaced it with government planning.
Yes, in the formal economy. So this is for, anybody who wants to have a big business and grow his business. There's always been an informal economy consisting of very small firms. But as far as any sort of official manufacturing sector is concerned, effectively they lost all decision-making power over basic things like, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce. Everything needed a license from the central government.
This is what they refer to as the license Raj
yes.
regime.
So that's the domestic industrial licensing system. Then you had the foreign exchange licensing system because India wanted to be self-sufficient. They thought self-sufficiency is what will lead to growth. So foreign exchange was centralized and allocated by the government, by the central government. So every time you wanted to import something, you had to go through another set of licenses, get a whole bunch of clearances to get imports to produce whatever you wanted to produce. So there were these whole set of license restrictions and price controls, arbitrary sort of rule changes by the government saying, well, do this and not that, and added on to all of that.
And this was with the goal of they were planning how to industrialize.
Yes, the goal was rapid industrialization. So try to catch up with the West in like 20, 25 years, because they believed that that's what the Soviet Union had done under Stalin. But at the same time, the first Indian Prime Minister Nehru, who was also the big freedom leader of the freedom movement, he didn't want to do what Stalin did politically. So he wanted to preserve democracy, but at the same time adopt some of the same policies adopted in countries like the Soviet Union.
And many commentators look at the performance of the Indian economy after independence and they say, well, at first he was successful. What are they referring to?
Well, so the first sort of 15 years after planning officially began in 1950, the growth rate and the per capita income growth rate was higher than under the British. Mm-hmm. And so lots of the planning enthusiasts felt vindicated. They said, look, we've done our job, we've boosted this growth rate upwards. But then the 70s were a dismal decade. And so for the whole period, 1950 to 80, if you look at it, the performance is very poor. But it started off with a lot of hope, a lot of enthusiasm, and sort of went completely wrong.
But that first period of so-called economic growth is measuring GDP growth.
Yes.
You don't think that's right, do you?
No, well, this is some of the pitfalls with using a metric like GDP, because it's an aggregate measure. So it hides what is actually being produced. So what happened in India was they were producing a lot of things that they could have imported cheaper from abroad. And plus the state was, through its plans, was producing all sorts of equipment and new machines and all of this stuff for which there was no demand within the country itself. So what happened was you had a lot of investment, you had a lot of growth of capital goods, but you didn't have what is supposed to happen as a result of it, which is increased consumer goods output of, more consumer goods of more quality and quantity. That didn't happen. So as far as the average person was concerned, his sort of daily intake of the two main commodities that any poor Indian needed at that time, basic food and clothing, that actually stayed stagnant or even went down in that period.
So it's not just about making stuff, it's about making
the right stuff.
The right stuff that actually
that people want. Yes.
Yeah, makes our lives better.
That's the way investment is supposed to work. It's supposed to lead to increased consumption.
So they had increased activity in making of the wrong stuff, but people's lives
stayed as bad as it was before.
This is something that comes up not in the context of the wrong stuff, but people measure GDP as if this is
scientific and that's it.
In the past year, we had this Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas, and some commentators said, GDP is going to increase. Well, yeah, we're going to have to replace the stuff that broke. That doesn't mean our lives got better.
Right, and that's one of the pitfalls in sort of looking at just this aggregate measure, often in terms of war. For example, in the American economy, lots of people say, World War II brought you out of the Great Depression. Well, it did, but in the sense of what did you produce? You produce tanks, you produce guns, what is that to do with, what does that have as far as the average person is concerned? His well-being or her well-being doesn't improve.
The average person during World War II in the United States lived less well than they did during the Great Depression.
Right, but GDP went up. So it has its uses, but we need to be careful about how we look at it.
Let's go back to the Indian economy then and what's happened since then. So in the 1970s, even by standard measures, it stagnated.
Yes.
in the 1980s, reform kind of starts, but it's really 1991 that reform starts, right?
Yes, the real big bang reforms happened in the early 90s. The two main controls we were talking about, the industrial and the foreign exchange licensing system, was removed. And that was the big step that was taken in the 90s. And really all through the decade, but starting in 91.
So particularly opening up to foreign capital flows.
Yes, foreign direct investment, domestically private firms who had all of these restrictions on which sectors they could and couldn't enter, and how many licenses they had to wade through to do anything. That was those controls were lifted in many areas of the economy.
And what's been the result?
Well, the result has been that, especially in the urban areas, life has gotten better for a vast majority of Indians, especially in terms of the way that it really matters in terms of actual consumer goods. All sorts of like televisions, mobile phones, refrigerators, the things you take for granted in the West now are actually appearing more and more within urban homes in India, to some extent in the rural sector as well, but a lot less.
So not just GDP growth, but
yes, actual stuff, the stuff that matters.
But you mentioned the rural areas
Yes.
at the end there that have kind of lagged behind, which
Yes.
points to there's still widespread extreme poverty in India.
Yes.
What's preventing a greater escape from that? And what are the reforms that haven't been done that would really help?
Yes, I mean, usually when people, the average Indian intellectual tends to be extremely socialist. So when they talk about the reforms, they act as if, India is like close to like 18th century, 19th century England or something like that, but it's not. The controls that were lifted were only over specific sectors. Some of the sectors that have done very well, like the IT related stuff, was never controlled in the first place. The Indian government wasn't smart enough to think up of controls for such a dynamic part of the economy. But unfortunately, what's happened is the agricultural sector is still highly regulated, and labor-intensive manufacturing is extremely hard. So, for example, you don't see unskilled labor-intensive big firms in India the way you would do it, for example, in China, because there are lots of labor laws preventing businesses from becoming too big in these labor-intensive sectors. So those are really the two big things that are holding the Indian economy back. So there's the rural areas, and the poor people who are flooding into the urban areas from the rural areas are the ones who sort of being left behind by this new growth that's happened in the 90s and the 2000s.
In contrast to the way we see economic development has happened, where people are agricultural productivity goes up,
Yes.
and people leave the farms
Yes.
and get factory jobs.
Yes, that's not happening. No. So you're right. In Europe, when it happened in the early 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution began, before that you had an agricultural revolution, effectively, where yes, the first starting point was, food output, became more productive, so people weren't that needed on the farm, so you could start industrializing. In India, unfortunately, that's not happened. The growth that's happened has been restricted to a few specific sectors, especially parts that are integrated with the world economy. That's largely the urban areas. They've seen a lot of increase in their per capita incomes, but unfortunately, a lot of unskilled, the average unskilled worker is being left behind, and that is largely to do with the regulations that are still in place that have been brought forward from the socialist era, and really, in fact, from the British era, because that's a whole other topic. But it's not like India was free market paradise under the British either, right? So a lot of those controls are really the way they were. In many ways, if you want to go and see how life was like in medieval Europe, you can take a trip to some parts of the poorest parts of India, especially the rural areas.
Well, it's good that that's starting to change, and
Yes.
hopefully we'll keep accelerating. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
When 53% of young people say they view socialism favorably, they can't be thinking of real socialism. They must be thinking of something like Sweden. But Sweden's not socialist. It's very capitalist. It does have a big welfare state, but that's not socialism. Real socialism involves government ownership of the means of production in the economy, the factories, the labor, the raw materials. That's only being tried in a handful of places in the world today, and they're all basket cases, including Venezuela. And in fact, everywhere where it's been tried in the world in the past have been turned into economic basket cases as well. Even more limited attempts at government planning of the commanding heights of the economy, as in the case of India, cause stagnation. When these places liberalize, it frees up the capital and the labor to make use of the resources and raise everybody's standard of living. I'm glad to see that process happening in India today, and I hope it starts happening in Venezuela sometime in the near future. We'll see you next time.